Okay, the 15th entry into the MCU in chronological order is Captain America Civil War. Let's waste no time. Let's get right into it. This movie acts as the third Captain America solo film while also acting as a continuation of Age of Ultron, turning it into Avengers 2.5. The Russo brothers return to the directing chair after doing Winter Soldier. They come back to do this movie. Overall, I think Civil War is fantastic. This movie continues that same tone that was established in The Winter Soldier, but expands upon it, and also expands upon the Winter Soldier story and the greater MCU as a whole. What Civil War did was basically prove that the Russo brothers were the true heirs to the MCU throne. And Civil War also proved that these guys can handle a large ensemble cast, give everyone a chance to shine, give almost every character their own little individual arcs that intersect with one another, and overall tell a great story that, like on papers, Civil War is trying to do so much, but because you have a talented team like the Russo brothers, they were able to make it all make sense. And that's why I'm a big fan. That's why I love this movie. Now, do I like it on the same level as Winter Soldier? Yes and no. I think Winter Soldier is the better movie, just simply because it tells a better story. And also it puts Steve Rogers through a more emotional journey than I think Civil War did. Now, does that make Civil War bad? Absolutely not. Now, during the course of this review, I'm going to illustrate a lot of my positives, because I do have a lot of positives, and I do got some negatives for this movie, but they're not really negatives that are like, oh my god, it ruins the whole movie. It's more along the lines of a personal perspective and what I think and what I would have done a little differently. So, without any further ado, let's talk about Captain America Civil War. And only appropriate, we start with the positives, and that is the cast. The cast in this movie pretty much has everyone coming back, for the most part. Chris Evans, Robert Downey Jr., Scarlett Johansson, Sebastian Stan, Anthony Mackie, Don Cheadle, Jeremy Renner, Chadwick Boseman, Paul Bettany, Elizabeth Olsen. You have Paul Rudd, and you also have the introduction of Tom Holland as Spider-Man. All these, and you have Daniel Brühl as the villain, Helmut Zemo. All these actors in this movie, I thought did a great job. The acting in this movie is superb, with Evans and Downey putting in the best performances up to this point as their respective characters of Captain America and Iron Man. The conflicting ideals between these two men is what make this movie interesting. Pretty much, Civil War tells the story that Dawn of Justice should have told, but Dawn of Justice did not know how to tell that story. So basically, the Avengers are going on this mission in Lagos, and as they're trying to capture Crossbones, played once again by Frank Grillo. During the altercation, Scarlet Witch tries to save Captain America from being exploded by Crossbones, but in so doing so, she throws him into a building, which kills a lot of people who just so happen to be Wakandan diplomats. Of course, this incident, on top of the events with Loki's invasion of Earth, the collapse of Shield and the collapse of Shield, and the events of Age of Ultron, along with the Logos incident, this pretty much has the United Nations push the panic button and want to implement this thing known as the Sokovia Accords, which basically means government regulation over the Avengers. Now, Rogers, he feels that the Avengers should not be regulated, and that they should have a freedom of choice, and that you can't save everybody, even though you want to. He has the ideal of free will and with no government control, while Tony Stark, on the other hand, he's more open to the Accords. He wants more government regulation. Now, you would say this, wait, I thought Tony Stark was against the government. Well, if you actually watch these movies in chronological order, the events of the Avengers, the events of Iron Man 3, and the events of Age of Ultron, they pretty much shape Tony Stark's world perspective. He's no longer the center of the universe. He's pretty much a small cog in a bigger wheel. And pretty much, he said it flat out. He's a man in a tin can when compared to everything else around him. And not only that, he kind of has this conversation with this mother who lost her child in Sokovia, and that also played a role in Tony Stark's perception, of wanting to have more government regulation, because in his mind, the Avengers need to be regulated because too much collateral damage is happening, and they can't, and it needs to be controlled and it needs to be stopped. Rogers, he's against that. More along the lines of Rogers is a soldier, so he understands collateral damage. He understands everything. He's remorseful for what happens, but he also believes in that individual free will. And these two conflicting sides are what cause a giant rift within the Avengers themselves, because you have Rogers, who has his team of people who they don't want to be regulated. They want to have their free will. While you have Stark and his team, no, they're more for the regulation. They think that the regulation is actually more of a good idea. And pretty much the entire movie is just the Russo brothers illustrating the differences between Rogers and Stark. And that's what, and a lot of their scenes together are phenomenal. You can tell that these two are friends, but they're friends with two opposing ideals and two conflicting ideals. And like I said, the Russo brothers handled it perfectly. In terms of the supporting cast that surround them, everyone does a good performance. You have Anthony Mackie returning as the Falcon. His relationship with Captain America was one of my favorite aspects of Winter Soldier, and you get more of that too. But you also get the budding tense, but you also get the budding relationship between him and Bucky, which I thought was actually really well handled. And it makes me really more irritated that the Falcon and Winter Soldier was the letdown that it was, because Mackie and Stan, for the few scenes that they shared together, they do have a genuine on-screen chemistry and a genuinely good antagonistic friendship that was forming in this movie. I think Elizabeth Olsen as Scarlet Witch, she has a very good story. Like, the whole story pretty much hinges on the mistake that she made in Logos and her conflict with that. And her relationship with Vision is actually laid down in this movie. With Vision, this movie establishes that Vision has has something for Wanda, and Vision sees Wanda as a good person that she is, but he also fears that everyone else does not see that. So Vision more or less goes out of his way to want to make sure Wanda's protected. While Wanda, on the other hand, she's the exact opposite. The relationship to me is actually formed really well. They have nice scenes together, especially the infamous paprika scene. So I like all that stuff. It was nicely well handled. And like I said, you have the stuff with Bucky, the Winter Soldier. His story is more or less a continuation from where Winter Soldier left off, where he's pretty much just trying to find out who he is, trying to find out his history, his backstory, because his mind has been wiped so many times. All his memories are all a jumbled mess. And we also get a big revelation at the end of the movie we also get a huge revelation at the end of this movie and Bucky's connection to Stark. Of course, there's this opening prologue where the Winter Soldier, kills these two people to steal Super Soldier Serum. At the end of the movie, we find out who he kills, and that further pushes a divide between Rogers and Stark. And I'll get to that momentarily when I talk about the villain. But yeah, I like Sebastian Stan's performance in this movie. I think he has a lot of cool scenes. I love the fight scene that he has with Black Panther in the middle portion. And I love the fight scene he has with the Black Panther. I thought that fight scene in Chase was actually really, really cool, and I liked it a lot. Speaking of which, you have Chadwick Boseman in his first portrayal as T'Challa, the Black Panther. I feel that this movie did a much better job at making me like the character of Black Panther than the character's own solo movie did. What the Russo brothers did with T'Challa's character in this movie, 10 times better than what than what his own solo movie did. Basically this, as I mentioned earlier, a bunch of Wakandans were killed during Lagos, which leads to this whole world meeting and the signing of the Accords, which is being orchestrated by Thunderbolt Ross. Yes, William Hurt returns as General Ross. We finally get some Incredible Hulk representation in the MCU. Excuse me. And you know what? I like every scene that William Hurt's in this movie. I love his portrayal as General Ross. I liked it in Incredible Hulk, and I like it in this. I like how he's pretty much the one who gives the Avengers the Accords, and I like how he's the one who's all for it as well. And I also like how he retired as an Army General, is now the Secretary of State. Now he's a man who has governmental power, which pretty much means he's nearly into untouchable. So I love it. I love seeing William Hurt return as General Ross. Now, it would have meant more if Bruce Banner was in this movie, but I'll get to that when I talk about my negatives. But just to see William Hurt return as the character of Ross, that's an automatic thumbs up for me, because I'm a big fan of the Incredible Hulk, and I really liked his portrayal as the Thunderbolt Ross. And having him be the one to pretty much force the Avengers into looking into the Accords, all the while, because it makes sense. Ross has experience dealing with these superpowered beings, being they dealt with Bruce Banner, who is the Hulk. He also had that scene at the end of Incredible Hulk where he and Stark have a little conversation. So Ross has got experience with this kind of thing. So I like it. So like I said, You can't go wrong by having him be the one who's pushing the Accords onto the Avengers. Good stuff. But now, back on track. We get to this whole thing with the United Nations, and we're introduced to King T'Chaka, and we're introduced to T'Challa. And the whole thing that went down is that there was a bombing that took place because of Helmut Zemo, who was trying to frame Bucky Barnes. And T'Chaka was killed. This sets off T'Challa's character arc in which he wants to get revenge on Bucky for the death of his father. And throughout the course of the movie, that's the only thing T'Challa wants. He just wants Bucky's blood for what happened to his dad. But when you get to the end of the movie and you find out who is really responsible for everything, this is where T'Challa basically has a change of heart. And this is where actually T'Challa understands that, Bucky and his dad, they were similar in a lot of ways. Like, T'Challa's dad was a victim because he was killed, but Bucky's also a victim as well because he's somebody who was basically had his life erased from him, and he was being used as a weapon for decades. And he's just someone trying to get his memory back. And he actually comes to the realization that when Bucky's not brainwashed, he is a good guy. He's not a bad guy at all. And he has that great line where he's talking to Zemo that vengeance has consumed the Avengers, but he won't let vengeance consume him. Pretty much establishing that if he wants to be the person he wants to be, he's got to be more noble and not look out for his own interest, but a greater picture. Within one movie, T'Challa was instantly likable to me. He had the best character arc. He went from being bloodthirsty and vengeful to actually having more of a perspective and actually establishing more of an alliance with Captain America and a mutual respect for Bucky, especially when you get to the mid-credit scene. Good stuff. And overall, I just thought Chadwick Boseman did a really good job playing the role of T'Challa. I mean, his African accent is nothing really all that desirable, to be honest with you. But in terms of a performance, he gives the character of T'Challa an elegance and a class to him. And when he's in Black Panther, he kicks ass in the suit. So I really don't have a whole lot of bad thing to say about the late, great Chadwick Boseman. You also got Don Cheadle returning as James Rhodes, War Machine. I like Don Cheadle in the role. I like him in this movie. I like how he's all for. Since Rhodes is in the army, he is more for the regulation of the Avengers because understand, he's like Rogers. He understands the negative side of it, but he also understands the pros of it. And of course, Rhodey just stands with Stark because they are best friends and stuff like that. And he does have some cool. And really does have some cool scenes peppered all throughout the movie, especially in the big airport fight scene. So I got nothing. So that's all good stuff. And then you have Scarlett Johansson. Then you have Black Widow. She is for the Avengers, but she's for the regulation. But at the same time, she also understands where Rogers is coming from, and she's kind of torn in between. She's kind of torn between her two friends, between Rogers and Stark. But she chooses the side of Stark. But she does choose the overall side of Stark because she also feels that there needs to be some regulation here and there. So in terms of the different motivations for the different Avengers choosing their sides, I thought the Russo brothers did a good job at pretty much establishing why each character has their own reason for wanting to join the sides that they join on. But you also have the individual stories as well that I find more interesting. You have Steve Rogers, who has to deal with the death of Peggy Carter in this movie. And the whole funeral scene is probably the most saddest scene in this entire movie, is where Rogers has to bury Peggy. And you really feel and I thought Chris Evans did a fantastic job in this scene. You can feel just the crushing heartbreak and that is in this man's eyes, and it's in this man's soul. And the scene where Black Widow comforts him really shows that these two have a very deep friendship with one another. I like this scene a lot. And it also establishes a budding romance that Steve Rogers could have with Sharon Carter, Peggy's niece, I'm sorry. So I like that stuff too. And of course, this also segues into Bucky's overall story, which is, like I said, him trying to find his identity and stuff like that. Bucky's whole thing is that it just takes Bucky to have these programmed words be fed to him for him to flip that switch and instantly go into Winter Soldier mode. And this is where the character of Helmut Zemo comes in, played by Daniel Brühl. I think Helmut Zemo is another underrated villain of the MCU, and he's like Alexander Pierce in a lot of ways, in which he's a villain who Now, Alexander Pierce was somebody who did villainous things for a greater good. Helmut Zemo, he is a villain because his villainy is based more off a personal vendetta. We find out that Baron Zemo was a Sokovian soldier, and we also find out that during the events of Age of Ultron, his family was killed in Sokovia while while the Avengers were trying to save it. This, of course, gave him a burning dislike for the team, for the Avengers, and he pretty much wanted to cause the split. Now, all this comes to fruition in the third act when Stark, Bucky, and Bucky and Rogers go to Siberia. They find an army of Winter Soldiers, and pretty much Zemo reveals his entire story to the trio. Yeah, and basically Zemo reveals that a brainwashed Bucky Barnes was the one responsible for the assassination of Stark's parents on December of 1991. And of course, this is what leads to Stark, and of course Rogers knew about this, and this is what leads to that final confrontation, which is Stark versus Rogers, which is what the first Avengers movie has been building up to this point for the last 4 years, and was not disappointed. Pretty much, Stark and Rogers are now fighting for the fact that Rogers chose to protect Bucky over choosing to take his side, and this is what leads to the final confrontation between Rogers and Stark and Bucky, which is a very fun brawl that basically ends with Stark destroying Bucky's mechanical arm, and that iconic shot of Captain America using his shield to block one of Iron Man's hand blasts. And of course, this leads to the official disintegration of the Avengers, with pretty much Captain America abandoning the shield and just walking away, with Stark pretty much Stark just being a broken man basically, when you look at it, because he's pretty much, now the Avengers is pretty much gone, and his friendship with Captain America is gone. However, when you get to the end of the movie, Rogers still considers Stark to be his friend, and if Stark ever wants to make amends and stuff like that, Rogers will always be there. So I like all that stuff. But basically, Rogers has to go on his own individual journey. He does not want to be regulated. He does not want to be regulated like Stark does. So that's pretty much the final battle between Rogers and Stark did not disappoint. It was great stuff. Having Bucky more or less as the linchpin within that fight also heightens it even more, because basically Rogers is torn between his two friends. He's torn between his best friend and Bucky Barnes, and he's also torn between his friend and teammate and Tony Stark, somebody who he's been having intellectual wars with all throughout this movie, as opposed to whether or not they should be regulated or not regulated. Now, of course, before you get to this scene, you have the fun as hell airport scene in which the opposing factions duke it out in a brawl. Now, it's more or less a skirmish and not really a brawl, because they're not there to kill one another. They're there to just fight it out. And boy, oh boy, does this movie not disappoint with the airport fight scene. Everyone has a chance to shine. Hawkeye, who is not really much of a character in this movie, he has a nice chance to shine. And also his begrudging relationship with Wanda is further expanded upon in this movie as well, with Hawkeye more or less acting like that adopted father to Wanda, trying to give her these half-assed motivational speeches that get to her. So I like that stuff. And I also like the interaction that Hawkeye has with Black Panther, and Black Panther just dissing him. That shit was hilarious. And you have the inclusion of Paul Rudd as Ant-Man. He has a lot of fun moments to do. We actually see him grow into Giant Man, which was a lot of fun. And then when he gets put into the raft, he has a nice exchange with Stark, and Stark pretty much dissing him. This movie could have expanded. I needed more Paul Rudd and Downey just acting off one another, because their little exchange in the raft made me want to see a whole movie of Ant-Man and Iron Man going on a wacky adventure with one another for some reason. I just think Rudd and RDJ could have had one of those movies that could have been absolutely just balls out hilarious, with the two conflicting personalities going against one another. But Ant-Man, even, pretty much he comes in from his own solo movie. We also established the fact that he had a run-in with Falcon, hence why they brought him in. So that was all cool. And I also like how Scott Lang is a Captain America fanboy. That was just hilarious. And it makes him joining his side even better. And I love how when Spider-Man takes Captain America's shield, Ant-Man gives it back and says, "I believe this is yours, Captain America." Like, he says it so proudly. I love it. It's funny stuff. It's good stuff, actually. And of course, speaking of Spider-Man, whew, we get the introduction of the MCU version of Spider-Man in this movie. And you know what? For a first impression, I thought the Russo brothers did a really good job at reintroducing Spider-Man into the MCU universe. And going back to the character's roots, having him be a teenager, I thought Tom Holland did a really good job of playing the character. I like the whole idea of Tony Stark being Parker's mentor. Basically, Tony Stark is this version of Peter Parker's Uncle Ben, and I like that stuff. I mean, yeah, there's the whole thing of, he's not Spider-Man, he's Iron Boy, he's Iron Boy, and all that nonsense. Take away all that stuff. Peter Parker is a genius. Tony Stark is a genius. It only makes sense that Peter Parker looks up to Iron Man. And if you look at the MCU in a retrospect, in Iron Man 2, the little kid that Tony Stark saved was a young Peter Parker, as confirmed by Tom Holland and Kevin Feige himself. So it makes a hell of a lot more sense that Peter Parker would look up to Iron Man, would look up to Tony Stark, and have his genius be based off the genius of that of Tony Stark. So I like all that stuff. And I like the awkwardness that Tom Holland gives the character of Spider-Man. I like the newer version of the Spider-Man suit. I like the interactions he has with a lot of the Avengers. I particularly love the scene of Spider-Man taking on the Falcon and the Winter Soldier inside the airport itself. And you have that nice little exchange where Falcon uses the Red Wing to incapacitate Spider-Man. Bucky questions him, and then Falcon and just caps off by saying that he hates him. That's the humor being used to its advantage, and that's pretty much that's fun stuff. Then you have the reference to then you have Spider-Man comparing Giant Man to an Imperial Walker from Star Wars. That's funny shit. And I just like the banter between Tom Holland and Robert Downey Jr. They have a really good on-screen chemistry with one another. I like the fact that the movie makes fun of kind of points out that Peter Parker has a hot Aunt May. Hey, listen, a kid like Peter Parker's age would have a relatively young, attractive aunt like Marissa Tomei. That's just real life. That's just how it is. Maybe back in the '60s, you have a grandma aunt, but in the modern day, a 16-year-old's aunt would be in her mid-40s to early 50s. So I like how they play that joke up a little bit. And I also like the little fight scene that Captain America and Spider-Man had, with Captain America saying, "Peter Parker, you're a tough kid." And I like the whole exchange of them being from Queens and Brooklyn. That was fun stuff to me. So yeah, the airport scene is worth it. It was great. The individual character arcs in this movie are also worth it, and they're also good shit as well. Like, this movie has a lot of good. Now, let me just touch on a couple of negatives before I wrap it all up. As I mentioned before, Crossbones makes his return. Frank Grillo as Crossbones makes his return in this movie. He's pretty much used as a plot device to get the ball rolling. I would have actually had him have a little bit more of a substantial role than what he actually would have did. Basically, having him be more of a partner with Zemo, as opposed to just being a plot device. That's just me personally. I would have did that. And actually, I think that's the only. Oh yeah, and also, like, the entire movie pretty much hinges on the fact, creates this idea that Zemo wants to go to Siberia in order to unleash all the other Winter Soldiers. We find out that was not really his motivation. I would have just taken that subplot out and kept Zemo's motivations much more mysterious to get to the third act, instead of dangling that carrot of a potential of the Avengers taking on a whole horde of Winter Soldiers. I mean, I like the idea of a setup, but it's kind of a weak end game they were implying with the Zemo character. That's just me personally. You also have the introduction of Martin Freeman as Everett, who plays more of a role in Black Panther and so on. This movie just established him as a character. He doesn't really do much, but it is what it is. I would have him do a little bit more. As I mentioned, I love seeing General Ross come back in this movie, but it sucks that Bruce Banner / the Hulk was not in this, because I would have liked to have seen Banner's perspective against Ross's perspective and see how Ruffalo and William Hurt would have acted off one another. Because I love the chemistry between Norton and Ross in the Incredible Hulk movie. I would have liked to have seen how Ruffalo and Hurt would have acted off one another as Ross and Banner. I thought that was a big missed opportunity with this movie, was not having the Hulk in it. so that way we can tease more of that feud that Ross does have with Banner. Maybe get a mention of Betty and stuff like that, which we don't get. But again, it's cool seeing him come back. Kind of a letdown because in a very important part of Ross's character, which is the Hulk, is not in this movie, which is a letdown. Because I also would have liked to have seen where Bruce Banner would have fallen the whole government regulation thing. Like, since he has this uncontrollable rage, is he all for being regulated or is he not for being regulated? That would have been a very interesting story to tackle with Bruce Banner as a character. So those are pretty much my big gripes and negatives, so to speak. Like, yeah, those are things that I would have expanded upon and would have put in the movie myself. And it doesn't take away fully from the overall movie, but those are just questions that I have. In terms of how the action sequences were handled in this movie, what the Russo brothers did in Winter Soldier, they heightened it with this movie. Every single action scene in this movie is directed with precision and perfectly paced. None of these action scenes drag out, and none of them are boring. They all have a uniqueness to them, and can't say enough about it. Then you get to the mid-credit scene, which reveals that, as I mentioned earlier, T'Challa found a new respect for Bucky, hence why he's going to keep Bucky in Wakanda and try and deprogram the Hydra-ness that's inside of him. I like that stuff as well. It also establishes this newfound friendship between T'Challa and Captain America, like this new alliance between the two. And then the end credit scene basically sets up Spider-Man and Spider-Man Homecoming. So good stuff. So as an overall movie, Captain America Civil War gets a 9 out of 10 for me. This movie was fantastic and a beautiful start to Phase 3. It sets up a conflict, it sets up the Avengers divide, and it makes it more impactful when Thanos does make his appearance in Infinity War, because he's basically going to be free reign when he comes in, because the Avengers are not together. So it makes it more easy for him to accomplish his goals. And when I get to Infinity War, I will go more into detail with that. But as an overall movie, I think this did a great job at being a third Captain America solo movie. It pretty much expanded upon what happened in Winter Soldier. We actually get to see the collateral damage of the Avengers coming together and the damages that it caused to the more grounded level of everything. I like the opposing ideals between Stark and Rogers. I thought it was illustrated as best as humanly possible. As humanly possible, and it's just an overall great movie. Yes, Captain America Civil War, 9 out of 10 for me. Let me know your thoughts in the comment sections down below. Like the video and subscribe, and I'll check you back next time for more.